America, your children have an amazing superpower. That's right. They can help save lives by simply washing their hands. Just 20 seconds of thorough hand washing after they've coughed or sneezed or been outside can help fight against the dastardly spread of germs. Armed with only soap and water and hands, your superhero can protect you, your family, and everyone out there in America land. Amazing! Find out more at coronavirus.gov. A message from the CDC and the Ad Council.
But it wasn't just another country. It was Cuba. As reporter Sam Lacey said when visiting Cuba to report on Jackie Robinson's spring training with the Dodgers, I heard the Cubans were deeply religious people. I have learned that baseball is their religion.
According to the reports, they were waiting for the girls. And we packed the stands every night. They loved to watch us play, practice. And in the games, they'd be walking around in the stands with the roll of money making bets.
They'd follow us around. Oh my goodness. I got pictures you should see. I mean, it was like playing a game. I mean, they'd sit up there in the bleachers, follow us outside the gate. It was fun.
They went wild over the women. We had 25,000 people. They said, baseball femenino, they're over there, they're watching the women. And we had to be escorted to the ballpark because those crazy, they love blondes. Oh man, they love blondes. And you had to hang on. We had to have the security people escort us to the game, to the ballpark, because they would steal your glove or anything.
So we get into Cuba and we trained there. It was hot, and we trained there very hard for 2 weeks. And when they saw how well we played, they couldn't believe it. Dottie Kamashak was the first baseman for Rockford Beaches. They said if she had been a man, they would have offered her $50,000 on the spot.
It was fun. They called us Amazons, because the girls over there are very, very frail, very feminine, and here we are, tough. Throwed like 16-pound bowling balls, and they throw that little tiny thing, and out there playing ball like men. They just couldn't believe it.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, greetings and salutations, everybody. How are you doing out there? My name is Tim Hanlon, and it's, of course, Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast, our little excursion, our little tunneling into the vortex of the past as we try to explore and unearth what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us this week, and maybe one of your friends pointed you in our direction. Perhaps you're a longtime listener or somewhere in between those two. Regardless of how and when and why you came, we welcome you to the proceedings. And as you probably know, we love to explore lots of things in the realm of pro sports that are no longer with us for whatever reasons. And we especially enjoy going back to leagues and teams and situations where we just fully are curious. We have more to learn about and discover from. And there's no better example of such than the All-America Girls Professional Baseball League of the 1940s and early 1950s. And as you heard there in our little intro, the stories just keep on coming. And this one in particular, with our guest this week, Kat Williams, who has written a couple of books about the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, AAGPBL. You say it fast. It's hard to do with the acronym. Is a little bit of an interesting sort of overlapping story of certainly the league itself, of course, and we've got into a little bit of the origins and the various twists and turns and the uniqueness of situation, as well as the unveiling and the rollout of the actual play of the game of baseball by these very pioneering women during the war and then thereafter. But our little story actually is a little bit to the realm of after World War II, 1947-ish or so. As you heard there, training for the upcoming season in 1947 actually started, and I think they went back a couple of more times in seasons after that. was in Cuba, Havana, Cuba, of all places. Now we've had a couple of explorations of Cuba and baseball already in different circumstances, right? With our pal Cesar Brioso, we talked about sort of the leagues in Havana before the Fidel Castro regime sort of took hold. We've talked a little bit about baseball in Miami, for sure, both in the minor and the major league levels. And frankly, how Havana and Cuba was actually on the roadmap on a number of different fronts for actually Major League Baseball, certainly minor league. But Major League Baseball, Havana, before the overthrow, was absolutely on the table as a possible expansion locale for Major League Baseball. But I digress. Our story this week, courtesy of Cat Williams, is about a bunch of things, in particular to the girls' league, the women's league, but also the recruitment of a number of Cuban women into this "quote unquote" All-America League, because as the ladies and their handlers discovered in '47, absolutely a wellspring of talent in Cuba, not just from males but from females. And we're going to get into the story of one of those ladies who made the journey from that preseason training environment to the show, so to speak, of the All-America Women's League, or All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Women, girls, why call them girls at this point, right? Come on, let's we're evolved, aren't we? And it's the story of a woman named Isabel Lefty Alvarez, still with us, by the way. And the story that Cat Williams has written is her life story. Lefty Alvarez, the improbable life of a Cuban-American baseball star, and is emblematic, I think, of a bold and courageous bunch of women who made the trek 90 miles and then some across the ocean, if you will. It's hardly an ocean between Havana and Miami. I mean, obviously, it is an ocean, but it's probably the smallest point to the United States to play baseball. And this is a fascinating story on a number of different levels. Number one, again, it's another sort of exploration into how women and baseball interconnect. And frankly, this golden era, this time when women were for their country, although if you ask probably most of the women to a person that are still around, or even back then, if they were serving their country, I think that was probably second or maybe even third on their list. Hell, they just wanted to play ball, as we'll get into with Cat in a few minutes. But what a dream, for sure, right? There's that. Number two, it's obviously the diversion and the spectacle of women playing America's pastime and trying to divert people's attention from the war. There's certainly that. And, and women, frankly, giving up whatever lives they were leading, whether they be teachers or in other careers, or perhaps even as homemakers or whatever, to play this sort of fantasy thing of baseball and get paid for it. Holy cow. But here's the kicker of this story, right? It's all that plus leaving your home country in Cuba, right, where you probably didn't even know very much English, as was the case with Lefty Alvarez, as we're going to talk about. She didn't know a lick of English, but she did know that she wanted to play, and she was pretty damn good at baseball. And the opportunity, once again, we get into this, we talked about a lot of other episodes, given the opportunity to play, right, and having your bills paid and then some, is probably just an indescribable opportunity. But it's certainly courageous, right? Because here's literally a girl who's not even out of her teens or late teens, getting the chance to come to the United States to play professional, believe it or not, baseball in another country and in the great big fat land of America. What an opportunity, and then what a life being afforded her and a dozen plus of her colleagues coming from Cuba into the United States to play in this magical league, the league of their own, if you will, the All-America Girls Professional Baseball League. It's the life story of Isabel Lefty Alvarez, as well as her Cuban and soon-to-be Cuban-American baseball colleagues. As we get into, once again, another sort of angle of the story of the All-America Girls Professional Baseball League, this week with our guest, Cat Williams, and it's coming up in just a few moments. Very interesting stuff. We try to keep it interesting. We do our best each week in our exploration of such, and hopefully we will delight you to no end this week in our chat. Coming up in just a moment's time. But first, we want to say hello and, of course, welcome to our pal Dustin Alameda out there in Northern California and his great site. It's 503 Sports. It's 503-sports.com. You know them. You'll love them. You can't live without them. They are known as the king of throwbacks. I don't know if that's trademark, but by golly, it should be. Dustin, why don't you call your favorite trademark attorney and get right on that? Why don't you? It's worth a couple of $100 to get that done. The king of throwbacks at 503 Sports, 503-sports.com. All kinds of great sports memorabilia, handcrafted custom jerseys that are not only replica, but also sized and shaped and compared to the actual items that they were back in the day. And they're tremendous. But, you know, if you go into I think this week is especially interesting, go into the defunct baseball section. And you're going to find a whole bunch of these kinds of jerseys, these handcrafted, custom-made jerseys. A 1950 St. Louis Browns jersey could be very cool to wear. Hey, how about a Colts 45 jersey? Yeah, that's what the Astros were known as in their first couple of years when they joined the National League back in the early 1960s. Harkening back to a couple of episodes ago, how about commemorating the life and times of Jim Bouton and all his friends during the 1969 Seattle Pilots journey? Well, they've got a Seattle Pilots jersey they do at 503-sports.com, as well as Washington Senators and jerseys from various versions of the Washington Senators for that matter. But they also have T-shirts. Look, you're looking for the Colts 45 T-shirt. They've got that. You want a Seattle Pilots red, beautiful premium T-shirt? You got that. How about the Boston Bees? Yeah, going way back. All kinds of great stuff. And that's just in the defunct baseball section. There's all bunches of sports and all kinds of items and stuff, all for you to find there and enjoy at 503-sports.com. And if you want to get, of course, your name emblazoned on the back of your handmade jersey, by all means, you can do that too. And whatever you decide you're going to buy, or things, items, plural, make sure that you write down and use often the promo code that we got for you. It's SEATS, S-E-A-T-S, SEATS. That's the promo code for 10% off all of your purchases. You want a jersey? Great, get 10% off that. You want a cap, a fitted hat? Great. You want a satin jacket featuring the Washington Senators logo from the 1970s? You got it. Go for it, but get 10% off all of those things and whatever else you buy at 503 Sports. And again, that's 503-sports.com. Again, promo code SEATS. Thank you to Dustin, and thank you to you. Thank you to you? Sure. Thank you for checking them out and hopefully making a purchase. And thank you also for sticking around for our great conversation with our new pal, Kat Williams, as we talk about Lefty Alvarez, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. And there's some interesting stuff here that even you diehard baseball fans will not have known before this conversation. And here it comes, courtesy of yours truly. Here it comes. Please enjoy. Maybe we could start our conversation with a little bit of a background about who you are, what you do for your proverbial day job, and then we can maybe kind of, round second base and get a sense of like how and why this league that continues to just dazzle and amaze and intrigue people caught your eye.
Yeah, sure. Yes, absolutely. Well, I am a professor of U.S. women's history and specifically women's sport history at Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. I've been here since 2001. And as I said, I was hired as a women's history professor, which is, of course, still what I teach. But fortunately for me, Marshall allowed me to grow and morph into a women's sport historian, which was my first love, not only from a teaching and research standpoint, but also who I was as a former athlete who played fast pitch softball in the days before Title IX and all that entailed. So that's the day job, but the unpaid full-time job is that I'm also the president of the International Women's Baseball Center, and we are a nonprofit focused on preserving and protecting the history and the legacy of girls and women in all aspects of baseball internationally. We are currently in Rockford, Illinois. We are fundraising to create a center there. We've had a presence in Rockford since 2015, and while we do not yet have a facility, we are there and promoting women's baseball and hosting fundraisers, and we're working on an outdoor museum that will focus on all aspects of women's baseball. And then, of course, the most recent book that I have out, and so I'm a busy woman, but it's great stuff. It's I live a charmed life.
You said pro? You said fast pitch. Did you play pro in the 70s by any chance?
No, I didn't play pro. And I was, I wouldn't have even been able to tell you where professional fast pitch softball was located in the 70s,
Yeah, well, there you go. Because we know that there was a league, and we desperately want to get into it because there's we have on our list of various explorations. I don't know if you're familiar with this movie called Burn the Ships, which is a documentary. It's available now out on Amazon Prime. And it's the story of one of the former National Pro Fast Pitch teams, which is the league that currently exists. It was a team in Ohio called the Akron Racers. And I'll send it to you after our conversation. I think you find it really interesting. But it starts off with a very strong deference to the women pro players in the 70s. This is also when there was a men's league too, which we've explored too. So that's very interesting in the respect that, and obviously that sort of sets the table, I think, right, for what I would argue is probably the first, truly professional women's only sport, birthed obviously from interesting circumstances, right? But perhaps I think a lot of people in today's, collegiate women's games, as well as the various pro leagues that exist, almost all of them to a person, seem to always point back to the pioneers of this very intriguing and still awe-inspiring league back in the 40s in pro baseball. Maybe a little sort of setup of sort of what made that thing so special. Obviously, the circumstances are so unique.
Sure. But I would disagree with that a little bit because and believe me, I have spent many years researching, interviewing, getting to know the women of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, and there is no one who is more dedicated to preserving their legacy and their history. But, women have always played baseball. They've always played, they've always umpired and coached, they've always tended the fields and kept the stats, and they've always been part of baseball since baseball's inception. And the first the first women's team to get paid was the Dolly Vardens, who were an all African American barnstorming kind of league. And so the Bloomer Girls of the 19th century, and then the Philadelphia Bobbies of the 1920s, and there has been a long history of girls and women in the game of baseball. Now, that is to take nothing away, obviously, from the All-Americans, but we do a disservice, I think, to the long history of women in baseball if we focus only on them and their history, because they stand on the shoulders of decades of women in the game. Now, I teach a number of sport history classes, and when I'm talking about this in my class, one of the things I use to illustrate this is I tell my students, if you drew a timeline of women's participation in the game of baseball, and we are talking specifically about baseball here, not softball. If you draw a timeline, the AAGPBL is one small section of an enormously long timeline. Women didn't start playing baseball in 1943, and they didn't stop in 1954. So I always want to make that clear, because I really believe that it's the continuum. It's the connection between the 19th century and those women and those umpires and so forth that allowed those women of the All-Americans to even have that opportunity. And certainly the women of the All-Americans are the ones who really allow for all the other women and girls to play the game after 1954. So I always want to make that clear. Now, but we can never overlook the importance of what they did and the importance of that league. And some of that, obviously, is the time. It is World War II. It is a time when, and certainly in hindsight, and as a historian, I see this all the time, this is one of our proudest times in this country. We stood up. We stood up to evil, and we beat evil. And everybody did their part. And those women of that league will tell you they believe they are every bit as much patriots as the women who were Rosie the Riveter or the women who joined the Wax. And so we can't overlook the fact that that is set in that context.
Oh, so, yeah, and there's no question that there's history certainly before and after. We actually delved into that with an episode a couple of years ago with our pal film producer John Leonidakis, who has a series out.
Oh yeah, John. Yep, I know John.
Yeah, and obviously the All-American girls for sure, but things like the Colorado Silver Bullets, and there was this ladies league baseball thing, and look, there's absolutely there's a litany of players. I even remember as a kid in the 70s, right? We had two women, ladies, girls playing in our trying to break into the baseball team at the time, which was seemingly kind of a bigger, deal seemingly at that point, but it made total sense because they were darn good players too. Right. And I think I think that's an incredibly important sort of backstop to all of this, because I guess I'm intrigued as to why. And I think I probably know some of the reasons. Maybe some of it is a certain motion picture that came out about 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, right. That may have something to do with it.
Maybe overexposes it and or arguably maybe even trivializes it. But, why? Okay, I guess the thing would be, why in this period of time during the war would it be seen that women would be not only good enough, but attractive enough, not physically, but I mean in terms of play and as a distraction for the diminishing availability of pro baseball from the male perspective? Like, what would give Philip Wrigley the idea that this would be a circuit full of quality players playing quality baseball that would attract people to come to the game and pay for it, right? Because it seems a little incongruous based on the long history and not so great history of baseball for women.
Yeah. And well, I think there are two things. First of all, Philip Wrigley was very involved in any way he could participate in the war effort. His company was very active in war production. And so there's that. But the thing is, too, we can't forget the fact that this was very much about Philip Wrigley and some other owners being worried about the health of baseball, and also it was financial. I mean, we can make this sound very romantic, and I think there's an element to that, and I'll get to that in a second. But it's also about the fact that we're we are struggling to come out of the Great Depression at this point. And so we have a lot of minor league fields in the Midwest, for example, that are not being used. It was mostly, or not mostly, but early on, it was minor league players who were going off to war. And then, of course, as we know, there were a number of major league players who did as well. And so, people were losing money. And so that's part of it. But then you add to that softball, women's softball. Now, softball in general for both men and women, but for this story, women's softball was huge. In 1939, women's softball drew more fans than minor league baseball. I mean, it was everywhere. And so when you have that already, and it was very, very popular in the Midwest.
Was it pro? Was it semi-pro? Was it amateur? Was it collegiate? It
was everything. No, it wasn't necessarily professional. It was just in general the game. I mean, there might have been what we would call in the 20th century recreational leagues. There might have been something that would be considered more of a semi-pro or something like that. But it didn't have that structure to it necessarily. But it was popular and people were coming to see it. And so then all of this comes together. And Philip Wrigley, and he was not the only one, there were some other owners, but Philip Wrigley is the leader in this. And it's a brilliant idea, right? You have these women who are already, let's face it, they're going to draw fans initially because people are going to be curious. And so you have these women, they're good ball players. Now the women were not just from the Midwest. They were recruited from all over, but they had a pretty impressive crop of softball players in the Midwest. So those women showed up in 1943, in May of 1943 at Wrigley Field for tryouts, very much like the scene in the movie where they all walk out onto Wrigley Field and there are all these young women out there and they try out and talking to the actual ball players about that experience, it just gives you chills. Because they never in a million years thought they'd ever have that opportunity. So, that's what starts it, right? That's what brings it together initially. And Wrigley was only in charge of this league for a short time. This was like a season or two, and then it was taken over by Meyerowitz. But, people came to those games, I think, in the beginning because they were curious. There's a scene in the movie where, there's a guy who rolls his pant legs up and he says, girls can't play ball. And of course, a third baseman hauls off and knocks him off the dugout. And, and I don't know that scene necessarily happened, but those kinds of things happened. But then very quickly, fans realized, wow, these women can play ball. I mean, they can really play ball. And so then their talent took over. And in many places, and Rockford being the best example of that, fans just, they loved the team. They loved it. They all kinds of fans came to the game. They gave these women, basically they made stars out of them. And so, there are a lot of things that go into creating that league. But we have to remember that league lasted till 1954. That's 9 years after the war ended. So this was not just about the war. In fact, it was 19.
Yeah, that's an amazing factoid, right? Because that's it does speak to not only the quality, but that there was something more than just sort of filling in gaps, if you will, for what was going on during the war. But you interviewed, in your first book, you did all these comprehensive interviews with all these former players. What was it that either individually or collectively drew these ladies to come try out and play? I mean, I've heard various things from, for the love of the game to, it's a paycheck, to patriotism, to, it's something other than staying at home. I mean, I got to think that the reasons why all these ladies decided to come out and play were just as unique and different as each of the individuals who came out to try.
I think that's absolutely right. But there are a few threads that run through those stories, and I address those in my first book, as you said, because that book is really about the impact of playing in the league. You know, there are a lot of histories written about that league, and I didn't want to write another history. Instead, I wanted to talk about what was the impact on those women's lives of playing in the league. And so that was my focus. And so getting to that, one way I got to that was by asking them, you know, what on earth possessed you? I mean, for some of these women, they were 16, 17 years old. They lived in small towns and on farms, and they had never been away from their families. And the next thing you know, they're on a train headed to Chicago. And so, you know, for many of them, the reasons overlap. First of all, to a person, they loved and played the game of baseball. They played baseball, they played softball, they played, and the stories repeat themselves. They played with their brothers on the street or in the local field, and they played with a local team of mostly boys and men, but they were good ball players. And all of a sudden, this guy shows up and says, "Hey, there's a professional women's league. Would you like to try out?" Well, who's not going to do that? You know, and there's an amazing story, and I included it in my first book, and it's the story of Maybelle Blair, who she is from California, very good ball player. She was a pitcher, fast pitcher, and a scout showed up and watched her play, and he came up to her after the game, and he said, "Can I go home with you and talk to your parents? I'd like to see if they'd let you come to Chicago to try out for this professional women's baseball team." And she said, "Oh, no, my parents are never going to let that happen. There's no such thing." "Well, you can, please let me come and talk to him." So he did. And her mother, as Maybelle thought she would, said, "There's no way my daughter is leaving this house with you. And I don't know anything about this. She's not doing it." And the scout said to her, "Mrs. Blair, I don't think you understand. We're going to pay her $65 a week." And Mrs. Blair said, "George, go crank up the car. I'm going to pack her suitcase." And Blair was headed out the door to go off and try out. So that was double what her father made. And so it was the love of the game, but it was just out of the Depression. And it was excitement. You know, it's hard for us sometimes in the 20th and now into the 21st century to look at the game of baseball and say, yeah, I would get on a train not knowing anyone. I would get on a train and travel halfway across the country in order to play the game. And most people are going to say, yeah, I'm not doing that. But it's baseball. You know, that's what's different. It's baseball. And certainly in the 1940s, baseball had that reputation. So I think it's adventure, it's money, it's excitement, it's an opportunity that, believe me, girls and women did not have normally in the 1940s.
Well, in your current book about Isabel Lefty Alvarez, right? So we can maybe segue into that for a little bit too, because the quintessential all-American girls, shall we say, that were being recruited or tantalized to come in and try out and play, right? It wasn't just exclusively, you know, women who played here in the United States. There was also sort of this, if you will, almost untapped reservoir, I guess, of players in Cuba too. Maybe you can give our audience a bit of a sense of sort of how that evolved. That wasn't the case as the league started up, but it certainly became part of the matriculation over time, though, right?
Yes, it did. And when Meyerowitz became, he had been the publicist for Wrigley. And so when he took over running the league, one of the things he realized is that we need to expand this. We need to be able to recruit more women to play. We need to, if we're going to grow and continue, we need to expand this. And every year they went to various places for spring training, just like Major League Baseball does. But they, unfortunately, and some of the stories are pretty hysterical, they went to some pretty awful places in Mississippi or in some other southern states. In 1947, they went to Havana, Cuba. And that was the same year that Jackie Robinson debuted in Major League Baseball, and they too went to Havana for spring training. While the All-Americans were in Havana, and this was already prearranged, of course, with a businessman in Havana. They played a team of Cuban women who their uniforms were very similar. They wore the dresses. There was all a very similar style of play. And they played exhibition games in what was then called the Grand Stadium in Havana. In 1947, Isabel, and she refers to herself as Lefty. That was the nickname that her teammates gave her, and she asked that I refer to her that way throughout the book because she felt like that describes her more than Isabel. So that's how I refer to her. But Lefty pitched at that exhibition game, and she did not give up a hit. And she was 15. She went back to her house. The manager, a couple of scouts from the All-Americans came back and talked to her parents about Lefty joining the league when she was 16. And so that's how she became involved. But she was not the first or the only Cuban to play. When Lefty first went, there were 3 other young women, and so the 4 of them went together. But before they headed to the United States, they played an exhibition tour all over Latin America. They played in Venezuela, they played in Nicaragua and El Salvador. Lefty tells a story about going to the palace and dancing with President Somoza. They were women's baseball in Latin America, baseball in general was huge. And certainly women playing the game was an exciting, unexpected, but very exciting time. And so it was that trip for spring training that really brought the league to Latin America. And of course, there were a number of players from Canada as well. Lefty came in 1947, and she played until she injured herself the last year of the league and did not finish that last year. But her story is remarkable. This was a young woman whose father was a policeman with the dictator Batista, and her brother fought with Fidel Castro in the revolution. And that plays itself out in her life.
We had it's interesting because it's interesting to know that backdrop, because you're talking about how baseball crazy Cuba was. We had a conversation with our pal Cesar Brioso about sort of a very vibrant minor league and frankly on a lot of different levels. There's a lot of angling going on over the years before the Castro regime came into play to even perhaps even look at Havana as being maybe a Major League Baseball expansion franchise. But that's just how baseball crazy the country was. And it stands to reason that maybe even disproportionately that various female players would be, ripe for the picking, so to speak, for this fledgling female league that was coming up in the United States.
Exactly. And baseball, Cubans refer to baseball as the passion of the island. And that's the title of one of the chapters in my book. It is woven into the fabric of Cubans. And the Cuban people have fought for decades and decades and decades for their independence from Spain. From it didn't just happen with it didn't just happen with Castro. And so when they were fighting in the 19th century, when they were fighting for their independence from Spain, it was in the early 19th century that baseball became so popular that it started to, and it was popular with what we might consider working class or the workers. And it became so popular that masses of people would show up to these baseball games all over the country. And that was also where they would start to organize. The Spanish outlawed baseball because they thought this was the game of revolution, and it was also keeping Cubans from participating in sports that the Spanish thought were acceptable. For example, bullfighting, and so baseball was the very fabric of that community. And last November, I had the honor of presenting at a conference that was the Cuban Baseball Federation in Havana. And through a translator, I told Lefty's story, and I looked out at the audience, and people were in tears. It was like they understood. Lefty was not the best ball player. This is not the story of the best pitcher or the best hitter. This is not Babe Ruth or Sandy Koufax. This is this young woman who came to the United States at age 15. She spoke no English. She had no clue what to expect when she got here, but she knew she got to play the game of baseball. And that's what the game of baseball is all about, right? I mean, that's what we all grew up with. That's why this story speaks to me personally, because it is very much about the way I grew up. It's this kid before Title IX. I didn't have a place to play, but without carving out a place to play, I would not have survived adolescence. And it's, Lefty is the epitome of what baseball means or can mean to some people. And certainly she represents what I think a lot of Cubans would agree is a serious love for the game.
Yeah, there's another angle, though, to it, right? Of course, she came with a handful of other players, during that 48-49 time, right? So how does that happen? Like, what's the proverbial and pitch, so to speak? How are they 15 years old, right? How do the parents feel about this? How does she sort of, it's also got to be this sort of, maybe there's the, I don't know, proverbial better life in the United States or getting paid to play the game that I love. How does that, collectively and individually, how do these young Cuban ladies, make that jump? Is it that similar to that of American women who are being tantalized by this league too? I got to think there's got to be even more either guilt or uncertainty than just somebody from Oklahoma getting in the car and driving to Chicago for tryouts.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And certainly Lefty's story is very, the engine that drove this was Lefty's mother, who had a very difficult life herself. Education was not a priority for girls and women in Cuba. There were really very few opportunities. You had to, quote, marry well. Lefty's mother was very determined that their family be considered and had the respect of the middle class. And when her father, who as I said worked with Batista, when Batista was overthrown, her father became a janitor, and so there was this idea that the family was going to be embarrassed, and so Lefty's mother spent years trying to figure out what is the thing that she's good at, what can we do to get her to a better place. Now, a better place literally and figuratively. And so she even entered Lefty into a beauty contest. And if you get the book, you'll see the pictures of Lefty. She was stunningly beautiful. But that was not who she was. Her mother quickly figured that out, but then she also realized Lefty was a seriously good athlete. She was good at fencing. She was good at volleyball. She was certainly good at baseball, and baseball was their love. And so in Lefty's
There's a great picture
case,
of her playing soccer even, too.
Yes.
Hitting the ball, yeah. See.
Exactly. She's an amazing athlete. And yet it was baseball. Because of the significance of that game to their family. Lefty tells a story. They lived in El Cerro, which is the neighborhood where the stadium is located. And she tells the story that her mother would turn the radio on and listen to the ball game, but they would open the windows because they lived so close to the stadium that they listened to the game on the radio, but they could hear the fans cheering. It was all about baseball. And so when this opportunity arose, her mother made sure she got a tryout with the Cuban team. And so in her case, her mother was all about it. Her mother was, yes, let's go. Let's get this done. Let's do this, right? And so, this is what her mother wanted for her. And in some ways, that's why Lefty did it. It wasn't that this was Lefty's passion. Now, she loved to play the game of baseball, but it was not that she spent her whole life, well, she was 15, but it's not that she spent years pining away for going to America. That was her mother's dream. And so she did. And now I don't know the family stories for the other Cuban women. I suspect it was something similar. Families often tried to find ways to help get their daughters other opportunities. And so I can only surmise that was the case for them as well. So, Lefty her mother pretty much put her on a plane with a suitcase and a ball glove.
Okay, what's this? Yes, the new book by Diane Shaw. I am happy and ecstatic to recommend it. It's called A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. Who is Diane Shaw, you may ask, and what's it about? Well, Diane Shaw is a writer of mystery novels and biographies and other great works. But before that, you may have known her in the 1960s and 1970s as the pioneering female sports journalist that kind of broke through the barriers, the glass ceilings, if you will, becoming really the first major national newspaper sports columnist who happened to be female at the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, for that matter. And her book is just chock full of great anecdotes. It's a memoir of all of her trials and travails, shall we say, in trying to cover sports in this country as a woman. Back in the 60s and 70s, you young whippersnappers, you have no idea how challenging it was. And there's a whole generation and then some of female sports reporters and columnists and writers and on-air personalities who can owe their careers to the doors that she just plowed through back in the day. And some great stories and some great anecdotes. And one that we especially love features a certain United States president and some interesting times when he was running a team and then trying to bulldoze his way through the old USFL, the New Jersey Generals in particular. I'm not going to repeat the story here. It's well worth the price of admission in this book alone. And we highly encourage you to check it out wherever fine books are found. It's called A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. It is published by the Indiana University Press and their imprint Red Lightning Books. And we thank both of them for offering our listeners an exclusive free chapter download right now. All you have to do is visit this little website. And I'll repeat it again because it's a little clunky. And you're going to get a free special sneak peek, free chapter of the book, A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. Just go to this website, iupress.org/jockstraps-good seats. That's iupress.org. It's the letter U, press, iupress.org/jockstraps, one word, dash good seats, one word. And again, you're going to get a free special sneak peek, a free chapter download of the brand new book by Diane Shaw, A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. If you don't remember that URL, we'll have a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com off of this episode. And you will enjoy this book. I guarantee it. And I appreciate our new friends at Red Lightning Books and Indiana University Press, hard to say, for their sponsorship and bringing our attention to this great book by Diane Shaw. He says, A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. I know you'll enjoy the free sample, and I know you'll enjoy the book. Try it out, and as they say, you'll be glad you did. All right, back to our conversation. Here it comes. Well, let me ask you this, sort of, both in Lefty's, from her perspective as well as those generally. I mean, what was it like, I guess in her words, because that's the story that you focus on, coming to the United States? Because I can't imagine it was the easiest of transitions for these 7 or 8 ladies, language-wise, culturally. And frankly, I also wonder, too, juxtaposed with, sort of this well-known sort of aspect to this league, right, which was the, I don't know, call it code of conduct, right, with the makeup and how ladies are to be presented in public and the etiquette and all that kind of stuff. That is, that's the, I don't know, crazily sort of, a female definition, I guess, written up by males, of course, right? But here you've got Cuban ladies coming in and almost having to sort of Americanize themselves when they don't even know anything about the country and the language, let alone how to sort of put makeup on correctly, right? So
right. It was, she was from Cuba. She was 15. She had never owned a coat in her life. And so her first story about arriving in Chicago is that this family, and she literally spoke no English, this family met her with a coat because they knew she would need a coat. And so she, that is her first memory. She talks about these tall buildings and being in this place that she just had she'd never seen anything like it. And so all of that is strange. You're right. It's strange. It's different. She doesn't know how to be. But one of the things she said to me, and I really believe this is true in a bigger way, is that she often didn't understand what people were telling her. She eventually worked it out. But, and this is not a direct quote, but it's close. But when we were talking baseball, that was a language I understood. And so through baseball, through that connection, she was able to learn some English, but also baseball as a language, baseball as this common thing. This way that now, saying that was a good hit in Spanish is different than saying it in English. But in that moment, what that means, right? And so that's the thing that I believe really sort of helped her. She had that thread, that tie. It was difficult. Don't get me wrong. She had some really, really difficult times early on.
Were she and her fellow Cuban players, were they, I guess I'm curious as to sort of how they were accepted or not, shall we say, by their playing brethren, so to speak. Were they maybe also, I don't know, uniquely marketed as an interesting sort of component to this already interesting proposition of women playing professional baseball? Like, I'm just curious how they fit in, how they didn't fit in, and or was it aided or prevented by, their ability to be assimilated, right? I would almost say there's one part of me that would think that perhaps Lefty Alvarez would have been intrigued and or aided by some of the the process of being an all-American girl in this, the makeup thing and the regimen and the etiquette and all that kind of stuff. It almost would almost maybe hasten her learning curve for becoming more Americanized and understanding this country. But I'm projecting, I don't know.
Right. Well, in terms of how they were accepted, there are some really interesting stories. First of all, the 4 Cuban women roomed together initially, and there's some really interesting stories that Lefty tells. A woman who became her very dear friend until she passed away, Jane Moffett, came to the league just shortly after Lefty did. And Jane was this New Jersey girl, same story as just about everyone else. And so they told her which room to go to in this hotel, and she went in there and she walked in and there were clothes hanging everywhere, drying, hanging from, cords everywhere. And she said, what the hell's going on here? And so all these young women started speaking in Spanish, which Jane, of course, did not speak. And so that was the beginning of a lifelong 70-year friendship. And so they both Jane and Lefty have told stories about their relationship throughout the years and certainly during their playing days. And it's interesting because obviously Lefty's perspective is very different from Jane's, but what Lefty says about that and about being part of the team was that she believed those were her friends, that they looked out for her. Now, they made fun of me sometimes, and they pulled pranks on me. One time they took her out into a rowboat in the middle of the lake and then took the paddles away from her. Some of these pranks were, pretty painful, I would imagine. But Lefty always follows it up with, but they weren't just kidding. They loved me and they cared about me. And I think that's true. But I'm not sure, most of these young women in really by today's standards, they were still kids. Right. And so kids can be cruel to one another. And I know that it was difficult. I know they probably, pulled stunts like that. They did things that were probably painful for those women. But when push comes to shove, here we are in 2020. Now Jane has passed away and a number of those women have passed away, but, they all still have that same bond. So I think the transition was hard. For Lefty particularly, one of the things that was most difficult was that in the off season, she had to return to Cuba. All the international players had to return home, and they had to have a contract in order to come back the next season. The hard part for Lefty was going home because her mother was very strict. And so she found herself a sense of freedom when she was in the United States. And so it was difficult. Of course it was. But Lefty, and I can really only speak for Lefty here, and I don't mean to say I can speak for Lefty, but I can address this issue in terms of Lefty's life. She was okay with how hard it was because, as she says, the most important thing that I got out of that, I became an American citizen. Lefty got a green card and then became an American citizen. And to her, baseball did that for her. And so whatever she did or she had to go through to get there was worth it.
That's very interesting. See, all of this feels like it's almost to the untold portion of this All-America Girls Baseball League, because I don't think most recognize that there was this Cuban contingent of which Lefty was part. I wonder, too, what her experience was on the playing field, because I noticed that her playing days from 49 through 54 to when the league ended, she played for 5 different teams, right? Was that common for her Cuban player colleagues as well, or was that just common to players generally because they were trying to keep franchises afloat and sort of keep there didn't seem to be any loyalty, but it seemed like it was all the league was trying to reallocate players as the season sort of presented itself each year.
Right, and that was true. Players were moved around quite a bit. Now, it's also important to understand Lefty joined, she played for the Chicago Colleens and the Springfield Sallies, and both of those initially, and both of those teams were what were considered the travel teams. We might consider a rookie team. They were, they did a lot of exhibition games, so they were. So she was on those teams, and then when she went to Fort Wayne, to the Fort Wayne Daisies, that was kind of like going to the big leagues. So now the league itself didn't break it down in that way. I'm using the language we might understand today for baseball, but she so moving around was not uncommon, and that was now there were some players, of course, who played all their years with one team, but for ball players like Lefty, who were decent ball players but not superstars, that was pretty common, and especially if you started with the travel team, the exhibition teams, then you were likely to move around a lot, which you would want to do because then you would move on to one of the other teams. Now, she played obviously with Fort Wayne and then left Fort Wayne and then came back to Fort Wayne and then Fort Wayne became her home. And that's where she still lives.
Was there homesickness? Was there more assimilation? Was it kind of, would you argue that she was more looking forward, I guess, towards what this was evolving to and eventually becoming an American citizen? Or was there sort of this longing to perhaps, I mean, it feels to me, based on what you're telling me of the story, that this was kind of in her mind once she sort of got here and sort of saw the situation and struggled with the struggle. It almost feels like it was going to be a one-way trip eventually overall, right? Or was that in doubt as she kept going back every, off season?
Well, I don't know that it was a straight shot. I think she loved her friends. She loved playing baseball. She liked being away from Cuba. And this is important. Part of this, her life at home was very, very, very difficult, and so it's both a push-pull kind of situation because her mother was difficult, her life at home was difficult, and so some of it was she was just ready to be gone. She was ready to be out of that situation. And so I think it's important to understand it wasn't just as simple as, do I want to be in the U.S.? It was also about, I want to be away from there.
Yeah. Well, I'm also curious too. I mean, and this probably then overlays pretty nicely with, your interviews with the various other players too, is sort of what transpires after playing, right? Because it seems that it was still relatively difficult for her to kind of assimilate and adjust because, and this is sort of something that any sort of pro athlete or somebody who's played a sport to the level of being a professional, right? Once the career is over, unless you've had some preparation or some understanding about maybe what a segue could look like, it becomes very, very difficult very, very quickly because it's the only thing that you've known, right? So I guess the question is sort of twofold. Number one, was there a thread or a theme for most of these ladies as they ended their careers and the frankly, largely seemingly wondrous time that it was into, back into quote unquote society and regular life, so to speak. And then maybe how similar or dissimilar was that for Lefty Alvarez, given all of her, her challenges uniquely relative to, most of the other players?
Right. Well, there are a couple of interviews. One I did with a woman named Shirley Berkovich, who played for the Rockford Peaches. And she, people ask her, what was it like when the league ended? And she said, I was shocked because I always thought, this is just what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a professional baseball player, and there was this sense of, and she's not alone in this. There was this sense of, oh, this is fantastic. I'm going to get paid to play baseball. And then reality hits and, oh my God, what do I do? So for some people it was that. For other people, and this is one of the things I talk about in the first book, that these women made an enormous amount of money for women of that time. And what they did with that money was they went to college, they became doctors and lawyers and principals and teachers, and they ran businesses and they put siblings through school. I mean, they did amazing things. And in many cases, they sent money home so that they could help their families. So for some of the women, they saw this as the opportunity that it was. Lefty did not have the benefit of understanding that even. And so when the league ended, she knew, oh, I have to get a job. Well, that may sound relatively simple for some. Now, by this time, she, of course, does speak English, but it's very broken. But the real issue here was that she only had a sixth grade education. Part of the issue in the book that I talk about is this thing with education. She was terrified of taking tests, and it was just this awful experience. Well, she realized, of course, as an adult many years later, that she likely had a very severe learning disability. But and not having an education was one of the things that was most embarrassing for her. So when she would go apply for a job, she had to say that she only had a sixth grade education. So getting a stable job, she wasn't married, she was on her own, so getting a stable job was difficult. Now, one of the families that she lived with, the Blees, Mr. Blee was in management at General Electric plant in Fort Wayne, and through him, and certainly Lefty's own determination, she was able to get a job at General Electric on the assembly line, and that's where she worked until she retired. And so, her story is kind of different because there are all these other pieces and parts that come into play. And one of them is education. Of course, the language barrier. When the league ended, the women who were still playing, I think many of them saw it coming. Attendance was down and they could see this coming. But Lefty didn't have the ability to do that. And some of that was the language barrier. And so I think for her, she had this attitude of, oh, okay, well, then I'll go on to the next thing. But I'm an American citizen, and so I'm here and I can do this. And so that it was very, her story is, even if you compare her with the other Cuban women none of whom stayed in the U.S., her story is different. And so it's a story of courage and determination. And I still, I've known this woman now since 2003, and we've had countless hours of conversation and interviews, and I am still stunned by the courage it took to get on that plane at age 15, and then ultimately to stay in the U.S. and become a citizen. It's pretty astounding.
How did you discover her and her story? Like, how did it present itself to you, and how did you latch onto it and realize that this had to be a story to be told?
Well, I went to the All Americans have a Players Association, and they have a reunion every year. Now they have fewer of them. They won't have one this year because of the coronavirus travel ban. But in 2003, I went to their 60th anniversary reunion in Syracuse. I was It was looking for a project to work on, and so I was told about this, and I went, and I walked into this lobby of this hotel, and all these women, and they're all laughing and talking. Of course, all of them, older women, and they're laughing and talking, and this woman walks up to me and she says, with this heavy accent, "Have you seen Jane?" And I said, "I don't know Jane." And she looks across the lobby and she handed me her suitcase and she said, "Oh, holy cow, there she is." And she took off running across the lobby with me in tow, carrying her suitcase. And that's when I first encountered Lefty and first met Jane Moffat. And I just was immediately taken by she was funny and warm and kind, and we became friends. And then the more I got to know her, and the more I got to know just little snippets of her story, I thought, because for me, the history of women's baseball is not about who was the best hitter, who was the best pitcher. It's not about stats. It's not about who was the first one to do whatever. It's about what the game has meant to girls and women, and because of my own story, because of what it meant to me, and because of the way it saved my life as a kid. And I saw some of that in Lefty. And we were sort of kindred spirits, I think. And so over the years, she just continued to tell me stories. And I thought, this is not your typical biography of the All-Star. But this is, to me, the most important story that can be told about the importance of baseball. And so that was the thing for me. I love and respect this woman very much, and what she has been able to do, and what that league has been able to do then for girls and women who came after them.
All right. Well, I'm going to tee up the obvious question to sort of wrap up here. I mean, is this loaded question about legacy, right? And I don't want to get trite about it, because I think everybody kind of
sure.
But, you have a unique sort of purview into this, given all the interviews and the relationships that you develop by those conversations, and certainly with the story of Lefty Alvarez in this new book. I mean, I am at once, it's easy to see sort of, as we sort of talk about just generally on this silly little show about sort of on the backs of pioneers, are created, especially in the realm of mostly male-dominated pro sports, right? I mean, there's just tons and tons of history about sort of like what happened prior to sort of make this kind of crazy, large industrial sports industry business, right? What it is, right? These kids today, they don't understand, right? But with the sort of extra label and or flavoring of the women's game, so to speak, and women's sports generally, right? So much has been achieved. You mentioned Title IX and all kinds of sort of pro breakthroughs and the equalities, frankly, that have, been historically, underdeveloped and are finally starting to come around. I mean, after all this time, but yet, on the pro level, right, there still seems to be an inequality, I guess, in terms of the opportunities. Maybe there are some still that are, but national pro, fast pitch, right, is still what, 5 or 6 teams, right, after 10 years of trying. The WNBA, still, according to the NBA, relatively, money losing or proposition. There hasn't been any, attempt at really a professional women's baseball kind of league since the 1990s, right? And yet we've had more players, more female players in all sports who are, better, stronger, faster than they've ever been before. And you'd think that perhaps there could be, more opportunities and more of a chance to, I guess it's just a dumb white guy question, right? About like why, how far have we come, and maybe how far have we left to go? And how does the women's league of yore sort of play into all that? Because it's clearly not it's not lost. I mean, it's not something that should be forgotten. There's lots of good things that came from it and was an exclamation point for what exists today. But we're still not fully there now, are we?
No, we have a long way to go. We have, as I said early on, girls and women have always been part of the game, and they didn't stop being part of the game when that league ended. But it has been hard. Part of that is because, of course, before Title IX, it was okay to keep girls from playing Little League, for example, or it was okay to say, oh, you can't play, you have to go do this, you can't play baseball, you have to play softball. And even after Title IX, that was 1972, we still have, there is no women's professional baseball. And that doesn't mean that girls and women aren't playing. There are organizations like Baseball for All that puts girls on, hundreds and hundreds of girls on the field every single summer. But there's no organizing body to step in and say, we want, or here, we're going to help create this professional women's baseball league. Now, I think Major League Baseball, and I am speaking from a personal opinion now, I think Major League Baseball should step up in the way that the NBA did with the WNBA. And they are, to their credit, they are doing some things. They have Trailblazer series where they bring girls in from around the country for trainings and stuff like that. But, the time is long past. And I am very clear. I am talking about baseball here. I played competitive fast pitch softball. I love the game of softball. It is not baseball. Baseball is not softball. Softball is not baseball. And I am the strongest proponent of Title IX you will ever encounter. I think it is the single most, probably the second most important piece of legislation for women in this country since the 19th Amendment. But I am telling you, it is Title IX that helped to create this divide. Boys play baseball, girls play softball. Because after Title IX, there had to be what they considered, similar sports. Oh, here, we'll let the boys play baseball, and an equivalent sport would be softball. So, yeah, here, you go play softball. And again, it's not that there's anything bad about softball, but it is not baseball. And, I could go on about this, another whole podcast. I could talk about this, but I'll just say this, and I think it is absolutely wrong to call baseball America's game when 50% of Americans can't play it.
No, that's well said. And you also think too, I mean, you were mentioning the WNBA and the NBA, and there have been in treaties that the fledgling Women's Pro Hockey League could be more tucked in under the wing of the NHL. We've seen flirtations of women's professional soccer and Major League Soccer sort of eventually sort of combining. But there are many green shoots, right, in all these other sports, and it doesn't seem too far-fetched. I speak of which I know of what I speak. My younger daughter, who now has gravitated towards soccer, but for a couple of years she wanted to play and did, with a few other girls, by the way, baseball in an integrated fashion with the boys, and because she was fascinated with the eye-hand coordination thing and the speed, and it wasn't because because it was like, well, why not? Right? I mean, there's literally no barrier in her mind. It's just like, well, this is interesting. Why don't I try this? But yet, without any,
isn't that great?
Yeah, well, that's terrific. But it's also, and you can see this with a lot of women's sports, and frankly, some men's sports too, without sort of that aspirational mechanism of a pro league, right? There is just a natural and almost sort of understood, cul-de-sac, right? You can't go any further. Sorry, right? Whether it's college or with a lack of a pro game, right? And that's, you're mentioning all these girls and women who do play baseball in all these different other environments. I mean, it's got to be dispiriting to a certain extent that there is no sort of formal final place to go. Not that there's any as other women's pro sports have shown, not any tremendously gigantic riches at the end of the rainbow still, but still it's something to aspire to, right? And I don't know, it seems unfortunate, and you wonder who all the other Lefty Alvarez's and all the other women of the time of the 40s and 50s, who's to say that there wouldn't be another pool of great talent that could stock a league, you know, maybe modestly set up and wisely financed. This country is rife with tremendous female athletes of all shapes and sizes and talents that, could absolutely stock a baseball league and then some.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. And in fact, what I would love to see, the International Women's Baseball Center, we're about preserving the history and the legacy, but we're also about using that history to help create opportunities for girls in the present. And one of the things that I would love to see is a women's league. Because, people say to me, why bother? There's never going to be a woman in the major leagues. So what? What is the percentage of boys who play Little League that go on to the major leagues? It's tiny. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get an opportunity to play. And I would never argue that there should necessarily make way for women in men's Major League Baseball. Now, I will say this, if there's a woman who's good enough, then she darn well better get a chance to try. But let's face it, men are stronger, they're bigger, they're faster. I played shortstop, and I'm here to tell you, if I have been run over and kneed and spiked by any number of players, but if that had happened to me, I'm about 5'4", and at that time weighed about 120. And if I had been run over by a 6 foot, 200-pound man, I'd been broken in half. And so, I'm not saying that should happen, but why not have a women's league? Most girls and women want to play against other girls and women. They want that competition. And I think it's a shame, but you know what? I think it's going to happen. And I think the girls that are playing right now, they're going to force that to happen. And I hope I live to see it.
All righty then. Thank you to Kat Williams. And there are 2 books, yes, count them, that you want to add to your collection and purchase wherever good books are found. Or, of course, you can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode. 165 is the number. Episode with Kat Williams. And you can click on the convenient link to get one or both of these books. The first one is Isabel Lefty Alvarez, The Improbable Life of a Cuban-American Baseball Star. That is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. And that is the current book that Kat has out. And her previous book from our friends at McFarland is also worth your time and effort. And it's called The All-American Girls After the AAGPBL, How Playing Pro Ball Shaped Their Lives. We made some allusions to some of the interviews that Kat did for that book as well. Again, both of those are available wherever good books are found. Perhaps you're an independent bookseller. We certainly encourage you to go that route. But if Amazon is the easier path, by all means, try to do so through our website's a link to that. And again, that's at goodseatsstillavailable.com, where, of course, you can also find all of the stuff, all of our previous episodes. You want to find our social media links, you can do that. We're at, on Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, we're at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find a Facebook page to us. All the links to those are there, as well as you can find a link there to our email newsletter. Just sign up right there off the website, and you will get each and every weekend a little update, a little head start on what our episode's going to be this week, or that week, or whatever week. And you'll be in the know, shall we say. And of course, on our website, you will also find, what else will you find? Lots of other good stuff. You'll find links to our, of course. How about our email? Yeah, you want our email address? Well, hell, you don't have to go to the website for that. We'll just give it to you right now. It's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. AAGPBL.com. There's a whole bunch of ways to follow us, to keep in touch with us, and enjoy all the great episodes we've had for you in the past, and plenty more, I assure you, yet to come. Before we run, I want to say a quick thanks to the folks that we got that clip from at the top of the show. That clip is, I think you'll find that on the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League website, which I think is AAGPBL.org. And it's also, you'll see all these various videos as well on YouTube. And this one is part of a series from the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. And they've done a ton of stuff in conjunction with the alumni group of the All-America Girls League. And it's just great stuff. I mean, just tremendous. And there's a whole bunch of ladies who are still around and alive and kicking and then some. And just some great stories and real oral histories out there. And hopefully we'll get a chance to get into some more of these great stories like we did this week, especially in this case, the Cuban influence on the quote-unquote All-American League. Fascinating and undiscovered stuff, at least for me it was. And again, our thanks to Kat for joining us in this endeavor. We also want to say our great thanks to our pal Jerry Payne, of course, each and every week, who does his best to put all of our collective pieces together and make it sound somewhat listenable. And Jerry Payne Audio Excellence, we tip our AAGPBL hat. How about a Rockford Peaches hat this week in your general direction? Thank you, kind sir. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Once again, as always, please indeed stay safe out there. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, take care. We love you. And see you next week.